The early sun stretched long shadows across the quiet farmland at the edge of Pinewood Estates. A light mist clung to the ground as Ethan Cole's old pickup truck rumbled down the gravel road, kicking up dust behind it. The familiar creak of the gate greeted him when he stopped in front of his property, the same grain warehouse that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. It was his pride and livelihood, a place he'd turned into a workshop and storage site after retiring from farming. But as he approached the building that morning, something felt wrong. The massive sliding doors he always kept padlocked, stood slightly ajar. Ethan frowned. He distinctly remembered securing them last night. He stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against the gravel, a faint metallic scent of oil in the air. As he reached for the door handle, the sound of muffled car alarms and faint chatter reached his ears. His stomach dropped. When he slid the door open, the sight that met him stopped him cold. The warehouse was packed wall-to-wall with shiny SUVs, luxury vehicles, all gleaming under the sunlight filtering through the dusty skylights. BMWs, Lexuses, Range Rovers, easily a dozen of them lined up like a dealership showroom. The smell of fresh wax and hot rubber replaced the earthy scent of grain and wood. Ethan took a slow breath, jaw tightening. His workbenches were shoved aside. Oil stains marked the floor where he had refinished old tools just days ago. Someone had even used his extension cords to plug in portable coolers and lighting rigs. This wasn't a random trespass, this was an organized takeover. He stood in silence for a moment, processing. Then, the sound of approaching voices broke the stillness. A cluster of people in pastel polos and sunglasses rounded the corner, and at their head was Nancy Holt, president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, clipboard in hand and self-importance practically radiating from her posture. Her smile froze when she saw Ethan. "Oh, Ethan," she said, blinking, pretending surprise. "Didn't expect you to be here this early." Ethan's voice was low but steady. "Nancy, what's going on in my building?" She chuckled, as if his question were naive. "Oh, don't get so tense. We had a little situation with parking overflow for the neighborhood's fall social event tonight. The community center lot's under renovation, so we used this space temporarily. It's so close by and, well, so empty most of the time. It's practically part of Pinewood Estates anyway." Ethan blinked slowly, struggling to stay calm. "Nancy, this warehouse isn't part of Pinewood Estates. It's my property. It's been in my name since before your HOA even existed." He pointed toward the gravel drive. "That fence line marks the community limit." Nancy's smile didn't falter. "Oh, come now. The county records might say that, but your warehouse is adjacent to our common area. It falls within our community's aesthetic boundaries. That makes it a shared visual asset." Ethan let out a sharp exhale. "Aesthetic boundaries? That's not a legal term." "Maybe not in your book," she said, flipping a page on a clipboard, "but according to our board's jurisdictional guidelines, anything within a quarter mile of HOA-maintained property is subject to community standards." She gave him that smug, performative grin he'd seen before, the same one she used when fining people for mailbox height or front lawn weeds. Ethan stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Nancy, you broke into my building. You moved my things. You let people park here without my permission. That's trespassing." Nancy crossed her arms, her voice lilting with condescension. "Technically, the door wasn't locked when we arrived." Ethan pointed toward the lock dangling from a latch, clearly cut in half. "Because you cut it." For a brief second, something flickered behind her eyes, a twitch of guilt, quickly buried beneath her usual arrogance. She shrugged. "It was an emergency. You weren't answering your phone. I don't owe you an answer." "I don't answer to the HOA," Ethan said flatly. "And you sure as hell don't get to use my property like it's a parking lot." Nancy gestured vaguely toward the SUVs. "We'll only need it for a few days. Once the event's over, we'll clear it out. No harm done." Ethan's gaze moved across the vehicles again. One had a slow oil leak staining the concrete floor he'd spent months sealing. Another had scraped one of his old storage racks. His throat tightened. "You've already done harm." Behind Nancy, a few board members exchanged uneasy looks. A man in a golf cap muttered, "Maybe we should have checked first." But Nancy's glare silenced him. She turned back to Ethan. Listen, I understand you're upset, but we're all neighbors here. Sometimes, cooperation means compromise. You'll be compensated for any minor inconvenience. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped past her, walking deeper into the warehouse. His boots echoed against the floor as he ran a hand over the damaged wood of his workbench. His fingers brushed against sawdust, displaced tools, a cracked measuring cup. It wasn't just a space to him, it was personal, built from years of effort after his father passed away. The warehouse wasn't just storage, it was legacy. He turned around slowly. His calm had hardened into something colder. "Nancy," he said quietly, "you have until tomorrow morning to move every single one of these cars off my property." Her lips parted, almost in amusement. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Ethan said. "Tomorrow morning." Not a minute later. Nancy tilted her head, feigning pity. "Ethan, don't be difficult. We're the HOA. We represent this community. You don't want to make things ugly." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "You already did." A long silence followed. For the first time, Nancy's confident expression faltered. The hum of a nearby car engine filled the air as another SUV backed into place near the corner. Ethan didn't move. He simply stood there, the picture of quiet defiance. Finally, Nancy scoffed and turned away, waving her clipboard dismissively. "Fine. We'll discuss this at the board meeting tonight. I'm sure we can come to a mutual understanding." As she walked off, Ethan remained where he was, staring at the row of foreign cars cluttering his family's building. His jaw flexed, his mind already working. Boundaries, land deeds, property laws, county permits. He wasn't impulsive like some of his neighbors. He believed in structure, in doing things the right way. And if the HOA wanted to treat this like a legal gray area, he'd bring the black and white of the law right to their doorstep. He took one last look around, then pulled the doors shut behind him. The padlock was gone, but in its place, Ethan looped a new chain through the handles, heavier, industrial grade. He clicked it shut and tested the lock. Then he took out his phone and snapped several photos of the damage, the license plates, the vehicles lined up inside. The evidence was stacking up nicely. As he drove away, dust trailing behind his truck, he glanced at the HOA clubhouse at the edge of the street. He could already see the cluster of residents setting up decorations and string lights for the night's autumn social. Nancy stood in the middle of them, directing volunteers with that same air of control. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. They had no idea what was coming. By tomorrow, every single SUV in that warehouse would be gone. Legally, officially, and very, very publicly. The following morning, the sun was already high when Ethan's truck pulled into the county records office. He'd spent half the night organizing documents, pulling out every deed, survey, and boundary map he owned. The more he looked, the angrier he became, not out of rage, but out of disbelief at the HOA's audacity. He had the papers right there. The property was clearly marked outside of Pinewood Estates, separated by 43 feet of buffer zone and a small irrigation canal. No clause, no loophole, no annexation order connected him to the HOA. Yet somehow, Nancy Holt had convinced herself she had jurisdiction. Inside the office, the clerk, a kind woman named Marla who'd known Ethan for years, double-checked the boundaries for him. She traced her finger along the lines on the official survey map and said, "She can't touch your land, Ethan. You're as separate from that HOA as the county fairgrounds." Ethan gave a curt nod, thanked her, and left with certified copies. The truth was clear, and now he had the paperwork to back it up. By mid-afternoon, Ethan was standing at the front doors of the Pinewood Estates Community Center, where the HOA board was holding its weekly meeting. Through the frosted glass, he could already hear the echo of Nancy's voice, confident, commanding, and utterly certain of her power. When he pushed open the doors, the conversation faltered. A dozen board members sat around a long table decorated with pumpkin centerpieces. Nancy sat at the head, wearing a coral blazer and pearls, her expression brightening into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan," she said smoothly, "how wonderful of you to join us. We were just discussing the event tonight. You'll be happy to know your warehouse has been immensely useful." Ethan didn't bother with small talk. He walked to the end of the table, laid down his rolled-up survey map, and spread it open with deliberate precision. "This," he said, pointing to the thick red boundary line, "is the official jurisdictional limit of Pinewood Estates. And this," he tapped the shaded rectangle beyond it, "is my property, my warehouse, my land. You and your board have no legal right to enter it, use it, or park a single tire on it." For a moment, no one spoke. A few board members leaned forward to study the map. Others glanced nervously toward Nancy, waiting for her to respond. Her smile tightened, but she kept her voice syrupy sweet. "Ethan, I understand your concern, but as I mentioned yesterday, the warehouse visually impacts the community. It's within our shared viewscape." Ethan cut her off, his patience thinning. "Your viewscape doesn't override private property law. You cut my lock, damaged my work area, and turned my building into a parking lot without consent. That's trespassing, plain and simple." His words dropped like heavy stones into the silence. A man at the end of the table shifted uncomfortably and whispered something about checking insurance. Ethan caught it but stayed focused on Nancy. "You have 24 hours, he continued, "to move every car out of that building, or I'll call the sheriff." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calm authority in his tone carried more weight than any threat could. Nancy leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the clipboard, studying him like a stubborn child refusing to cooperate. "You really want to make this into a legal mess," she said finally. "You think calling the sheriff will make you popular with your neighbors? You're part of this community whether you like it or not." Ethan straightened, folding his papers. "No," he said simply, "I'm part of this county. The community stops at my fence line." The quiet in the room stretched, tense and heavy. One of the younger board members, a woman with blonde curls, finally spoke. "Maybe we should just move the cars," she murmured. "It's his property, after all." But Nancy shut her down with a glare. "We're not moving anything until the event concludes," she snapped. "It's one night. He'll survive." Then, turning back to Ethan, she smiled again. "You can't tow community vehicles without facing consequences. The HOA will fine you for interference." Ethan gave a short laugh, not mocking, but incredulous. "You'll fine me for removing cars illegally parked on my land?" He shook his head. "You go ahead and try that. I'll make sure the county attorney sees those fines before they're printed." For a long moment, Ethan and Nancy just stared at each other, her arrogance against his quiet fury. She tried to hold her composure, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now, the first sign of doubt cracking through the wall of control she'd built around herself. Ethan could feel the rest of the room shifting too. The board members who once nodded at every word she said were now avoiding her gaze. The power dynamic was changing, slowly but surely. Finally, Ethan rolled up the map, tucked it under his arm, and said, "This is your warning, Nancy. Tomorrow morning, if those SUVs are still inside my warehouse, I won't be knocking on your door. I'll be standing there with the sheriff." He turned to leave, but before he could step out, Nancy's voice followed him, sharp, brittle. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. The HOA protects this neighborhood. We decide what belongs here." He paused at the doorway, glancing back just long enough to say, "And the county decides what belongs to you." Then he left without another word. Outside, the evening breeze swept across the parking lot, carrying the faint sounds of music and laughter from the nearby event preparations. Ethan climbed into his truck, set the deed folder on the passenger seat, and stared through the windshield for a long moment. His mind wasn't clouded with anger anymore, just clarity. The lines were drawn, literally and figuratively. They had trespassed, lied, and acted like they owned what wasn't theirs. But tomorrow morning, the law would speak louder than any HOA vote or clipboard ever could. Ethan started the engine and drove off into the fading sunset, the silhouette of his warehouse standing firm against the horizon, a silent symbol of the fight he was about to win. The morning sun burned away the fog that hung low over the fields, replacing it with a sharp golden light that caught the dust motes drifting through the air. Ethan stood beside his warehouse gate, coffee mug in hand, waiting. The heavy chain he'd installed the night before gleamed across the steel doors. Behind it, the muffled sound of car alarms and engines starting echoed faintly. The HOA had begun their event preparations early, still assuming they had the right to be there. But this time, Ethan wasn't alone. From down the gravel road came the deep rumble of a county-issued Ford Expedition, its tan paint catching the light. A red and blue bar glinted across the top, and when the vehicle stopped, the emblem of Pine County Sheriff's Office gleamed on the door. Out stepped Sheriff Dale Harper, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calm presence that could silence a room without saying a word. He adjusted his hat, glanced around the property, and nodded to Ethan. "Morning, Cole. You said we've got some uninvited guests." Ethan nodded, his expression firm but measured. "Morning, Sheriff. Yeah, you could say that. They broke into my warehouse, cut the lock, filled it with their cars, said it was for an HOA event." Harper raised an eyebrow, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. "HOA, huh? You've had trouble with them before." Ethan gave a dry chuckle. "Not personally. I've kept to myself. But they've been expanding their control lately. They think this place is part of their jurisdiction." The sheriff crouched, brushing dust off the gravel road with the toe of his boot. He pointed toward a thin strip of overgrown grass running alongside a shallow canal. "That's your boundary line, right?" Ethan nodded. 43 feet outside the HOA limit, verified yesterday by the county clerk. "I've got certified documents in the truck." Harper grunted, clearly satisfied. "Then it's pretty straightforward. If your warehouse is off their map, this is trespassing, plain and simple." He closed his notebook, the decision already made. "Let's take a look inside." Ethan unlocked the chain and slid the doors open. The warehouse came alive with light, spilling over the rows of glossy SUVs lined up inside like trophies. The sheriff let out a low whistle. "They weren't kidding around," he said. "Looks like a dealership in here." As if on cue, the main door to the warehouse yard opened and Nancy Holt stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. Her coral blazer from the previous day had been swapped for a navy one, the kind that screamed authority. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice echoing. "What do you think you're doing, bringing law enforcement onto community property?" The sheriff turned toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, this isn't community property. This belongs to Mr. Cole." Nancy gave an incredulous laugh. "That's ridiculous. This building has always been part of Pinewood Estates' visual jurisdiction. The HOA board voted last month to include it as a community resource." Harper arched an eyebrow. "You mean you voted to include someone else's land?" She blinked but recovered quickly. "We operate under community charter expansion guidelines, which," Harper interrupted evenly, "hold zero weight under county property law. You don't get to vote on other people's deeds." The warehouse went silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. A few HOA members had trickled in behind Nancy, phones raised, filming. Ethan stood back, letting the sheriff handle it. Harper stepped closer to Nancy, his voice calm but carrying a firm edge. "Ma'am, I'm going to be real clear about this. You and your association broke into private property, caused damage, and used it without permission. That's trespassing, property damage, and unlawful entry. Normally, that'd mean charges." Nancy's face flushed bright red, her mouth opening in protest. "Now wait just a minute. We didn't damage anything. We just parked our cars here temporarily. The community needs parking for our fall festival. We were acting in good faith." The sheriff gave a slow nod. "Good faith doesn't cut through locks." He pointed at the severed padlock hanging from the door latch. "See that? That's forced entry. And every one of those vehicles in here is illegally parked on private property." Ethan could see the composure slipping from Nancy's face. She adjusted her blazer, trying to regain control. "If you're suggesting I move them, you'll have to wait until after the event tonight. It's already scheduled." "The logistics," Harper raised a hand. "Ma'am, I'm not suggesting. I'm ordering." Nancy's jaw tightened. The board members behind her exchanged worried glances. One of them whispered, "Nancy, maybe we should just move them," but she shot him a look that could kill. "No one's moving anything without a board decision," she snapped. That was the breaking point. Harper took a slow step forward until he stood squarely between her and Ethan. "Let me save you the trouble of a vote," he said, voice steady as stone. "I'm authorizing immediate removal of all vehicles on this property. Mr. Cole is within his rights to contact a licensed towing service, and any interference will be considered obstruction. He turned to Ethan. You've got the go-ahead, son. Document everything for your records. Ethan nodded once, his chest tight with both relief and quiet satisfaction. Nancy gaped, her voice rising in disbelief. You can't be serious. You can't just tow our cars. That's theft. Hopper looked her dead in the eye. No, ma'am. That's called enforcing private property law. You and your board are lucky he's handling this civilly. He tipped his hat to Ethan. You handle it right. Call your tow guy. I'll stick around to keep the peace. For a long moment after the sheriff spoke, the warehouse hung in tense silence. Nancy's confidence had cracked entirely now. Her eyes darted from the sheriff to Ethan, then to the rows of shiny SUVs, each one representing an HOA member about to lose a very expensive parking spot. Ethan turned to her, his voice calm but with steel beneath it. You had your chance, Nancy. I warned you yesterday. Now I'm done talking. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. Tom? Yeah, it's time. Bring the trucks. Every one you've got. Nancy stepped forward, panic edging into her tone. You'll regret this, Ethan. The HOA will take legal action. He met her gaze without flinching. Good, he said. We'll do it in court, where facts still matter. Hopper gave a small nod of approval, his hand resting casually near his holster, not out of threat, but as a reminder of who held authority here now. The sound of distant engines rolled through the air as tow trucks began approaching down the gravel road, their rumble growing louder by the second. Nancy turned pale. Hopper adjusted his hat again, squinting toward the horizon. Sounds like your backup's here, he said with a faint grin. Let's make this clean. Ethan looked out over the scene, his warehouse, sunlight glinting off the SUVs that had invaded it. The sheriff standing beside him like a wall of law and order, and Nancy frozen in disbelief as the roar of the tow trucks grew nearer. The fight was no longer about words or neighborhood politics. It was about ownership, respect, and the simple truth that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. As the first tow truck pulled into view, Ethan took a long breath, feeling the weight of weeks of frustration lift from his shoulders. Let's get to work, he said quietly. The sheriff nodded, and together they stepped back toward the warehouse doors. For the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan felt completely in control. The HOA had tried to take what wasn't theirs, but now the law itself stood on his side, and justice, loud and unmistakable, was rolling in on four wheels. The first tow truck rumbled onto the gravel drive like a beast waking from hibernation. Its bright orange lights spun lazily in the mid-morning sun, reflecting off the chrome grills of the SUVs lined inside the warehouse. Behind it came another, then another, a full convoy led by Tom Rivera, Ethan's old friend and owner of Rivera Recovery and Hauling. Tom leaned out of the driver's seat with a grin, his mirrored sunglasses catching the light. Heard you've got yourself a little traffic problem, Ethan, he said as he hopped down, his boots thudding against the dirt. More than a dozen vehicles, most of them high-end. You sure you want all of them gone? Ethan nodded once, his expression calm, resolute. Every single one. Sheriff's authorization is on record. No damage, no shortcuts, do it clean and by the book. Tom slapped him on the shoulder. You got it, brother. We'll make it look like a ballet. The air was already vibrating with the sound of diesel engines, hydraulics, and the metallic click of chains. The quiet farmland had become a stage for justice, loud, legal, and unstoppable. Inside the warehouse, Nancy Holt stood frozen in disbelief as the first tow operator began securing a white Lexus to his rig. Her voice came out shrill, almost panicked. Stop that. You can't just haul those away. Those are community vehicles. The sheriff, leaning casually against the doorframe with his hands resting on his belt, didn't even flinch. Ma'am, he said evenly, they're parked on private property. The owners requested lawful removal. You're welcome to document it, but you're not stopping it. Nancy spun on her heel toward Ethan, her face red with fury. You're insane. You're humiliating yourself and this entire neighborhood. Ethan met her gaze calmly, almost pitying her. No, Nancy, I'm setting things right. There's a difference. He stepped aside as Tom's crew moved with mechanical precision, chains ratcheting, hooks locking, wheels lifting. Each vehicle rolled backward in a slow, graceful arc before settling onto the truck beds. The sight was strangely satisfying. Polished luxury cars being hauled away from a place they never should have been, the HOA symbol of superiority reduced to cargo. The other board members began to arrive, drawn by the commotion. A man in a golf cap shouted, "This is outrageous. You can't tow HOA property." Tom, tightening a chain, gave a small laugh. "Funny, I don't see an HOA logo on any of these titles." The crowd murmured as he waved the paperwork in his hand. "See this? County authorization, signed and sealed. Everything's above board." The sheriff's voice carried over the growing noise. "Anybody interfering with the towing operation will be detained for obstruction. You can file complaints at the county office later." That shut them up. The soundscape of the moment was something almost cinematic. The rhythmic clank of metal, the steady hiss of hydraulics, and the murmur of onlookers watching power shift right before their eyes. A few residents, tired of Nancy's overreach, even started filming, but this time their lenses weren't aimed at Ethan. They were capturing the HOA's downfall, live and undeniable. Ethan didn't gloat. He simply watched, hands in his pockets, the faintest trace of satisfaction tugging at the corner of his mouth. Nancy's last stand came when she pulled her own Mercedes SUV in front of the warehouse entrance, blocking the path of the final tow truck. She stepped out, arms crossed defiantly, heels planted in the dirt like a general refusing to surrender. "This one doesn't move," she declared. "You'll have to go through me." Ethan sighed softly, shaking his head. Sheriff Harper approached her slowly, like a man defusing a stubborn bomb. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to step aside," he said calmly. "This is the last warning." Nancy smirked. "What are you going to do, arrest me for parking?" Harper's eyes narrowed, the faintest smile at the edge of his lips. "No, ma'am, for obstruction of lawful enforcement." The tension snapped in an instant when he gestured to his deputy, who stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Nancy's confidence evaporated. Wait. Fine, I'll move it," she stammered, scrambling back into her SUV. The engine roared, tires spinning on loose gravel, and she jerked the vehicle aside just as the tow truck rolled forward to claim it. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Good choice." Nancy sat frozen behind the wheel, glaring at Ethan through the glass. The humiliation burned in her eyes. He gave her a single nod, not smug, not vengeful, just final. Her car was the last to go, hauled off like all the others, the HOA's power symbol literally dragged down the road. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, the warehouse stood empty again. The air was filled with a smell of oil and dust, but to Ethan, it smelled like freedom. Tom's crew began packing up their gear, cheerful after a long day's work. "All clear," Tom called out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Every car accounted for, documented, and delivered to the county impound lot. You'll get your copy of the report tonight." Ethan nodded, shaking his friend's hand. "Couldn't have done it without you." Tom smirked. "Oh, you would have found a way. But I have to say, that woman's face when her car got hooked. Worth the gas money." Even Sheriff Harper cracked a rare smile. "You handled this cleaner than most folks would have. I've seen people go to war with HOAs and lose everything. You did it by the book." Ethan glanced back at the now quiet building. "I wasn't looking for a fight. Just respect." They forgot what lines mean. The sheriff nodded, adjusting his hat. "Well, they know now." As the last tow truck disappeared down the road, its red lights fading into the dusk, Ethan stood by the warehouse doors once more. The concrete floor bore the faint marks of tire treads, but to him they looked more like victory scars. For the first time in weeks, the place felt like his again, silent, secure, and untouched. He locked the new chain back in place and turned toward the sheriff's vehicle. "Thanks, Dale," he said quietly. "Any time," Harper replied, starting his engine. "You did everything right. Let the paperwork do the rest." Ethan watched the patrol car roll away before heading to his truck. The night air was cool now, carrying the faint scent of hay from the nearby fields. Above him, the stars were starting to show, and the old warehouse seemed to stand a little taller in the fading light. He knew the HOA wouldn't take their defeat quietly. Nancy Holt wasn't the kind to retreat without a counterstrike. But for now, Ethan allowed himself the rare comfort of peace. He'd drawn his line in the dust, and for the first time, the HOA had been forced to recognize it. The law had spoken, and justice had rolled through Pinewood Estates on steel wheels and flashing lights. As he started his truck and pulled away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror at the warehouse standing against the twilight. A small smile crossed his face. "That'll teach them to mess with a man and his land," he muttered to himself. The gravel crunched beneath his tires, and somewhere behind him, the faint echo of a chain settling into place carried across the fields. Final, solid, unbreakable. The morning after the towing spectacle, Pinewood Estates was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. Word spread faster than wildfire. Every porch, coffee table, and online neighborhood forum was alive with debate, outrage, and, much to Ethan's surprise, admiration. Pictures and videos of the tow convoy were everywhere, uploaded by residents who couldn't resist documenting the fall of the HOA empire. Clips of Nancy Holt shouting at the sheriff had already racked up thousands of views on local community pages, with captions like "HOA Queen loses her crown" and "Farmer outsmarts board tyrants." The once feared HOA board found itself the subject of ridicule. People who had been too afraid to speak before were now stepping forward with their own stories. Fines for mailbox colors, threats over lawn height, tickets for improper parking. The illusion of control had shattered overnight, and the neighborhood was beginning to see what Ethan had known all along. The HOA's power was built on intimidation, not law. Ethan, meanwhile, was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the county newspaper spread before him. The headline read, "Sheriff backs local landowner in HOA dispute, vehicles towed after illegal occupation." He read it twice, slowly, letting every word sink in. Beneath it was a photo of him standing beside the sheriff, expression calm and resolute. The article laid out the story clearly. The HOA had unlawfully stored vehicles on private agricultural property without consent, violating zoning laws and state trespass codes. Sheriff Harper's statement was quoted word for word. The landowner acted within his rights. The towing was lawful, documented, and carried out under supervision. Ethan folded the paper neatly and set it aside, exhaling a slow breath. It wasn't victory he felt so much as relief. Months of tension had finally broken, and the silence that filled his kitchen felt heavy, but clean, the kind of silence that follows a storm. Across town, the HOA's headquarters, a once pristine office building near the neighborhood's entrance, was in chaos. A hastily called emergency board meeting had erupted into shouting. Nancy Holt, her composure cracked, slammed her hand on the table. "This is a smear campaign. That farmer manipulated the sheriff and the press," she barked, her voice hoarse. But the other board members were no longer her loyal chorus. One of them, a weary-looking man in a gray suit, spoke up for the first time. "Nancy, the county records show we violated property codes. Ethan warned us. You ignored him." Another woman added, "Do you realize what this means for us legally? The impound fees alone are over $12,000, and that's before restitution." The color drained from Nancy's face. She looked around, realizing the tide had turned. No one was defending her now. The HOA's attorney, seated at the end of the table, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holt, given the circumstances, the board is recommending your resignation, effective immediately. It's the only way to limit liability." For a long moment, Nancy sat still, eyes unfocused, as if the words had struck her physically. Then, without another word, she stood, grabbed her purse, and walked out, her heels echoing down the polished floor like the final toll of a bell. By the end of the week, the HOA was in shambles. 2 more board members resigned, citing personal stress. The county issued citations against the association for unauthorized use of private land and improper vehicle storage. Fines piled up, legal notices arrived, and the HOA's reputation, once ironclad, lay in ruins. For the first time, the homeowners of Pinewood Estates held an open community meeting without fear. It was held at the local park, not under the HOA's banner, but under a simple sign that read, "Residents Forum, everyone welcome." People came with folding chairs, homemade lemonade, and cautious smiles. Ethan attended quietly, sitting near the back, not as a symbol but as a neighbor. When someone recognized him and stood to thank him publicly, "You gave us our voice back, Ethan." The crowd broke into applause. He raised his hand modestly, smiling faintly. "I just wanted to remind everyone that rules are supposed to protect, not control," he said. "I don't want to run the place. I just want to live in peace." The applause came again, warmer this time, not for defiance but for decency. The community was healing, and in a strange twist of fate, Ethan's act of rebellion had brought people together more than the HOA ever had. Weeks passed, and life on Ethan's farm returned to normal, or rather, to something better. The grain warehouse was once again filled with the hum of real work, the grind of conveyor belts, the scent of stored corn, the soft murmur of radio music echoing through the rafters. The tow tracks on the concrete floor had faded, replaced by the marks of tractors and sacks of grain. One afternoon, Sheriff Harper stopped by, leaning against his cruiser as Ethan loaded feed. "Thought I'd check in," Harper said, handing him an envelope. "County clerk sent the final paperwork. Case closed. HOA paid every fine." Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was an official letter confirming full restitution for the property use and towing costs, with the county seal stamped at the bottom. "Guess that's the last of it," Harper said, tipping his hat. "For now," Ethan replied with a smile. "But something tells me Nancy Holt isn't done being mad." Harper chuckled. "Let her be mad. Anger's lighter than justice. It fades faster." The two men shared a quiet laugh as the late afternoon sun dipped over the fields. As the days rolled on, the warehouse became something of a local legend. People driving past would slow down to glance at it, whispering stories of the man who stood up to the HOA. Even neighboring towns picked up the tale. It became a modern folk story about standing your ground against arrogance and red tape. But for Ethan, there was no glory in it. He never wanted fame. He wanted fairness. Sometimes, as the wind carried across the open fields, he'd pause outside the warehouse and look toward the distant rooftops of Pinewood Estates. The HOA might rebuild, new faces might take over, but the message would stay: you don't trample a man's livelihood in the name of power and walk away untouched. The land remembered, and so did he. One evening, as the stars came out and the hum of crickets filled the air, Ethan turned off the warehouse lights and looked up at the night sky, clear, endless, and silent. "Back to work," he murmured to himself, locking the doors with a satisfied click. The world had returned to its rightful rhythm. Justice had done its work, and the grain warehouse, once filled with SUVs, was once again filled with purpose.